Australia's unemployment rate hits a 48-year low, putting more pressure on the Reserve Bank to lift interest rates. Australia cosies up to Pacific Island nations, and a lack of bees could trigger food shortages. It's Friday, the 15th of July, 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, you know how we get up early every morning for Fear and Greed, and yesterday morning, after our recording, I wandered outside, and do you know what I saw?
What?
I saw Elon Musk's Starlink satellites.
Really?
Cruising across the sky. And this is about kind of 5:30 yesterday morning. And it is one of the most spectacular things I have ever seen. Just to see this line of satellites just cruising across the sky at speed, completely silent, in a perfect line. It is just amazing. I took a photo. I'll send it to you.
Please do. I would like to know how you realised that it was Elon Musk's satellites.
Well, it's just because there was actually another satellite heading in another direction at the same time on the other side of the sky. And I'd read a news article saying, if you want to see Starlink, check it out at this time. So I thought I'll make sure I'm out there at the right time. And I was like, okay, maybe that's just the first satellite coming. And then I turn around, and on the other side of the sky, there's just suddenly this line of like 50 or more lights in a perfect sequence heading across the sky.
That's pretty cool.
It's almost feels a little bit sinister when you see it the first time, and then you just watch in complete awe. Anyway, completely unrelated to anything, but I've been excited about it ever since seeing it, and I wanted to tell you about it because I know we both love space, and Elon Musk is our favorite billionaire.
He certainly is. He's the most newsworthy billionaire.
Yeah, he certainly is. Now, after the show, Sean, you've got a chat with Craig Silbury from Illume, something a little bit different.
Yeah, so Illume's a technology company using its expertise to help pet owners, and specifically dog owners, work out how much to feed their pets based on their size, based on how much activity they do every day. Of course, the food is highly nutritional, very left field conversation, but fascinating.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and especially when you're a bit of a data nerd kind of thing. And the fact that there is actually all this data available, I found that quite extraordinary. It's a great chat. But anyway, the main story this morning, Sean, is all about jobs. Australia's unemployment rate has fallen to a new 48-year low of 3.5%. After nearly 90,000 new jobs were created last month, it means the ratio of job ads to job seekers is now 1-to-1.
No doubt, the Bureau of Statistics labour force figures released yesterday were stronger than pretty much anyone tipped. The last time the unemployment rate was this low was August 1974, when the survey was quarterly. The June data was the 8th consecutive rise in employment since the easing of COVID restrictions, and the majority of new jobs, about 53,000, were full-time positions. The participation rate, that's the measure of people looking for work, hit a record high of 66.8%, making that number even better. Female participation also hit a new high of 62.5%. The unemployment rate for women was 3.6%, and for men, it was 3.8%.
Sean, is there a risk that the employment market is too strong? Is that even possible?
Yes, definitely. Markets are best when they're in balance, and the labour market isn't in balance. When the unemployment rate was this low back in the 1970s, Australia drifted into stagflation. That's rising prices and low economic growth. No one wants that. The key to preventing that is to make sure inflation expectations, what people think is going to happen to prices, make sure those expectations don't become embedded in the economy.
Okay, so it's great news if people can get a job, but interest rates. Is it great news for interest rates? I don't think so.
No, not really. I mean, a red-hot labour market alongside fears of rising prices and inflation expectations puts further pressure on the Reserve Bank of Australia to lift rates. It's already done so the last 3 months and could well move again in August. By how much? Probably 50 basis points, but it could be more. This week, we've seen the Bank of Canada lift rates by a massive 1 percentage point, and US inflation come in at 9%. Other central banks to lift rates in the past 48 hours include South Korea, New Zealand, Singapore, and the Philippines. So there's plenty of global precedent for the RBA to go harder on rates. I suppose the ultimate question is how far will rates rise? Market economists seem to agree that the cash rate, which is the rate the Reserve Bank targets and influences all other rates, will hit 2.5% over the next 6 months. That's from 0.1% at the beginning of this year. That is a big, big jump in mortgage payments.
Yeah, it certainly is. All right, so it was a very big day yesterday. How about local markets? What happened?
Well, the S&P ASX 200 closed up 0.4% yesterday to 6,651 points. Technology was the best performing sub-index, followed by energy, materials and telcos. Real estate and financials were the worst. Among the large caps, the banks had a pretty rough day. ANZ was down 2.2%, while Commonwealth Bank was off 1.5% and Westpac fell just a little over 1%. The big miners did well. Fortescue was up 2.5%, Rio Tinto jumped 2%, and BHP increased 1.3%. Energy giants Woodside and Santos were both up around 1.5%. Now, EML Payments was the top performer yesterday, finishing up 12% after being sold off in recent sessions following the resignation of its CEO. Whitehaven Coal hit its highest level in more than 4 years, up 6.5%. That's because coal prices are almost at record levels. Another coal producer, New Hope, was up nearly 6%. Bega Cheese's share price fell 8.5%. That was the worst on the bourse yesterday, after warning that rising milk prices were set to hit the bottom line. The maker of cheese and Vegemite has had a pretty rough run, with its share price off 30% in the past month or so.
And what about international markets?
Well, the big news over the past 36 hours has been the record rate of inflation in the US. More of that in a moment. Equity and bond markets have been remarkably calm, though. One area where there is plenty of movement is currencies. The flight to quality, which basically means buying US dollars at the moment, has triggered some other noteworthy moves. For example, the euro has fallen below parity with the greenback for the first time in 20 years. Incredible. The Aussie dollar is trading at about 67.5 US cents. That's kind of around a 2-year low. And Michael, in crypto land, one of the world's largest cryptocurrency lenders, Celsius Network, has filed for bankruptcy. About a month ago, the company froze customer accounts, meaning anyone holding digital currencies with Celsius, and that includes many Australians, couldn't access their funds. The company has somewhere between 1 and 10 billion US dollars in liabilities and more than 100,000 creditors. Very bad news for the crypto market.
Okay, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, the Pacific Islands Forum has ended with leaders in the region warning the world needs to limit global temperature rises to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius or face devastating consequences.
The nations, including Australia and New Zealand, endorsed the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, which is a strategy for regional cooperation, economic development and climate change action. Climate change easily is the number one priority for the region, even if Australia seemed more concerned about China's influence. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese held what he termed a very constructive meeting with the Solomon Islands leader Manasseh Sogavare over the decision to sign a security pact with China in April. Mr. Albanese said he was confident China wouldn't build a base on the Solomon Islands. Mr. Sogavare said Australia remains the security partner of choice. It's nice to hear that. And Michael, just as an aside, Telstra has completed its acquisition of Digicel Pacific. That's the telco network in the Pacific region, which the federal government forced Telstra to buy, more or less. Now, the federal government funded most of the $2.4 billion needed. It was all about keeping Beijing away from buying it.
Sean, we've talked a lot in recent months about Star Entertainment, about all the findings that have come out of various inquiries. Now it continues with a Queensland inquiry into the casino group kicking off yesterday.
That's right. More news for us. The Queensland inquiry will have powers akin to a royal commission. It will consider potential breaches of anti-money laundering rules, management of VIP patrons, the use of China Union Pay debit cards to circumvent currency restrictions, and whether people excluded by police in New South Wales were actively encouraged to gamble in Queensland. It all just sounds so familiar.
It certainly does. Sean, the much-touted return to the office has stalled, it seems, thanks to the latest outbreak of COVID and people just not wanting to go back to their workplace.
It's hard to get people in the office when they just don't want to be there, really.
Yeah, I can't imagine it's the easiest task.
The Property Council of Australia's office occupancy survey shows that there was barely a rise in desks being used in CBDs during June compared to May, and the overall level of occupancy remains well below the pre-pandemic era. Sydney CBD tracked 55% occupancy. That is a lot of desks not being used. Melbourne is at 53%. Perth's at 65%, Brisbane is 64%, and Canberra's down to 53%. The standout is Adelaide, with a 71% occupancy rate last month. Maybe people from Adelaide just more social, perhaps. Winter doesn't help, and with huge numbers of COVID cases expected over the next 6 weeks, things are unlikely to improve in the short term.
Now, Sean, it's increasingly likely that there will be a bee shortage in South Australia and Victoria following the varroa mite outbreak in New South Wales. This is really serious.
Yeah, bees are incredibly important to the food chain because they pollinate plants, which helps them reproduce. And of course, they produce honey. We like that. But the pollination part is the really, really important bit. If bee populations decline, so too do crops. Now, almond grower Select Harvests yesterday said the varroa mite, which is an exotic parasite from European honeybees, weakens and kills local colonies. The parasite hasn't been a threat in Australia before, but it has arrived, and the hope is that the current outbreak has been contained in New South Wales. What that means is that hives won't be moved interstate, as is usual, hence won't be bees in South Australia and Victoria, and potentially food shortages.
Sean, the shutdown of the massive Prelude LNG project off northwest Australia will extend for another week after unions advised operator Shell of further work bans. It comes, though, as demand for gas surges.
Yeah, very poor timing. The project was shut down earlier in the week by the Australian Workers' Union, and yesterday bans were expanded such that it would be unfeasible for Shell to restart the project. Prelude isn't expected to recommence until 28 July at the earliest. Now, LNG is a major export of Australia, and Japan has asked Canberra for help after it lost its supplies from Russia. Germany has also pushed for higher global supply, but the industrial action stops all that from happening. Prelude is the world's largest floating LNG production project, and it's partly owned by companies from Japan, Korea, and Taiwan.
Sean, you might have noticed a little bit earlier in the podcast, I got a little bit distracted while you were talking. And the reason is I was watching on YouTube a video of the Prelude facility, and it is incredible.
Oh, yeah.
It is absolutely huge. And the thing that I actually got really stuck on was the food that they make in the kitchens on board the vessel. It is just the scale of the entire operation. And I was watching the food, and I suddenly realized that you'd stopped talking. And it suddenly just dawned on me that, I think I need to say something here.
You know, it's a bucket list thing for me to go and visit one of those platforms. They're just so large.
Yeah, if you can, check out this video. It is actually made by Shell, the video itself on the Shell YouTube channel, and just kind of showing the difference between what you would normally expect kind of from an oil rig platform to this being a floating platform. It's just well worth a look. And maybe, like me, you'll get distracted by the food.
Yeah, good.
Now, lithium miner Lake Resources has defended its strategy in Argentina, but its share price tumbled 7% yesterday.
It's a pretty interesting story. Activist short seller J Capital took aim at Lake earlier in the week, saying it had over-egged the prospects of its Carchi site in Argentina. Now, the short seller J Capital claims that the site has failed to hit deadlines. Lake came out yesterday and said J Capital's claims were incorrect, though really the damage has been done. Now, Lake's share price fell again yesterday. 7% is down 10% this week. It's really struggling against that short seller.
And there's plenty of smaller stories around the market this morning as well, Sean.
Yes, IT services business Data number 3 upped its profit, causing its share price to jump 13%. Dental group Pacific Smiles, don't you love that name?
Yes. It's one of those businesses that tells you exactly what it does.
That's right. Pacific Smile said patient fees had jumped in June, though that didn't help its share price. Ended the day down 2%. And the founder and long-time CEO of Booktopia, which is another great name, has been asked to stand down by the board following an internal review of the company. Tony Nash has been the heart and soul of the company, but yesterday was issued notice to vacate the role. The company laid off staff last month after the share price went from $3 less than a year ago to 17 cents. It's recovered somewhat to 31 cents. Mr. Nash remains on the board as a director and is a large shareholder in the company.
All right, moving on to overseas news, and it's been a very busy 36 hours in the US. We've had record inflation, a weaker Wall Street, and signs that the world's largest economy is slowing.
That's pretty much the story in a nutshell, Michael. Starting with the inflation figures, annual consumer prices rose by 9.1% last month, the largest increase in more than 4 decades. That's up the chance of the US Federal Reserve lifting interest rates by 75 basis points when it meets in a fortnight. Then the Fed's Beige Book, which considers economic conditions across the US, shows that while price increases remain substantial, there are some areas where inflation is cooling, along with a slowdown in demand and greater fears of a recession. That isn't a bad thing. Now, Wall Street reacted fairly calmly to all this news, slightly down, but it was pretty calm. I think that in itself is news, given what's been going on the last few months.
Yep. Now, the New Zealand government has announced new measures to deal with the burgeoning spread of the BA5 variant of COVID-19.
Under the country's current orange light restrictions, people are already required to wear masks in public indoor settings, such as public transport, shops and libraries. New measures will be introduced to ease the burden on hospitals already struggling with patient numbers. More people will be able to access 3 antiviral treatments, while mask wearing will be encouraged. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is very worried about the spread of COVID over there at the moment.
And finally, Sean, Sri Lanka's Prime Minister has declared a state of emergency after protesters again stormed government buildings.
The military was called in to restore order after massive protests following the fleeing of the country by its president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Security forces in riot gear fired multiple rounds of tear gas at demonstrators who climbed onto walls and security towers of the Prime Minister's compound, ultimately seizing control. A 26-year-old protester died from respiratory issues after being tear-gassed. Several people were injured. A real crisis in what is a wonderful nation.
Yeah, sure is. Now, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Craig Silbury from Illume, a supporter of this podcast.
Yeah, look, I think this is one of the more left field interviews I've done, but I love talking to Craig, and I knew nothing about it. He's basically a technologist who has used his expertise to create a diet for dogs. Now, he's a dog lover. He has 3 himself. He manufactures food that suits dog. Now, the technology part of it, it's kind of like a Fitbit on a dog. And so it measures how much exercise a dog has done, how much food it needs at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day. The dog bowl itself is technology enhanced, if that's a phrase, so that you know how much food to give it, how much food to take away. Really, really fascinating little business.
Yeah, it is actually a really good chat. It's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Friday, the 15th of July, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.